leave my father's store. For 3 weeks he camped outside. Grandma, you little victim. What the fuck?
She made a video about how creepy it is, the stories that grandmothers often tell about how they met a person's grandfather, like their love story not being okay. And if you go watch her video, look at all the stitches. I've literally seen like 30 today of people stitching with their own grandmother's story of grooming and assault. Stories like, your grandfather worked for my father. I met him when I was 10 years old, and a mere 3 years later, he asked for my hand in marriage. One woman said her grandfather walked up to the house after seeing her grandmother at like 12, skipping rope in the front yard, knocked on the door, and her brothers answered because her parents had died, and her brothers were raising her now. And he's like, can I have her to marry? And they were like, one less mouth to feed? Yes, take her. So her first conversation with what ended up being her husband was him walking up and being like, they said I can marry you, you're mine now. Or the woman who said her grandfather liked to stand up in church all the time and give testimony about how he would go to the elementary school bus stop to pick up his own daughter and how he saw his future wife sitting on that bus, one of her classmates, and was like, I knew I was going to marry her from the first time I saw her. And the whole church being like, God was speaking to you. But I've been seeing all these, and I can't help but think this is one of the things that MAGA stands for. When they talk about let's make America great again, let's go back to the way it used to be. This is one of the go backs they're talking about. Because they love to say stuff like, my grandparents, my grandmother hadn't been run through. She hadn't slept with 20 men. She was a virgin when she married my grandfather. She was 13. Of course she was. Do you know it wasn't uncommon back then for after the wedding night, the husband to take the bed sheets and hang them out on the line for the neighborhood to see the stain? So he could be like, see, I was the first one to cross home plate. Many of these women who were children at the time groomed and in some cases trafficked by their families. And then generations later, the story has been, polished and turned into like something positive. It's a love story because no one wants to admit that the legacy of their family's origin is something so horrific. So it turns into grandma grew to love him. And, they were supposed to be together. It was meant to be. And despite the odds, despite the age, despite all these other things, they found each other. No. And all these people trying to change things to meet the romanticized fake version of that origin. As if that's really what happened. Going like, oh, my grandparents together, 57 years. You don't see marriages lasting like that anymore. Lasting, she was a baby who was taken by a grown man and then impregnated. She didn't know any different. She had been brainwashed and manipulated. She was financially dependent upon him, and she had a bunch of kids, not to mention, what would people think if you all were to get divorced? All of that kept her there, miserable for 57 years. Bunch of y'all want to think about Pop-Pop like he's a sweet, loving man, but picture him at like 28 coming up to you, telling you how your 12-year-old daughter looks like she could probably have a lot of good kids for him. And you tell me you don't want to swing a hammer until there's just a chunky puddle.